Just 10 years ago, blogger and journalist Tony Carnes started an online magazine called A Journey Through New York City Religions, with the mission of moving through New York City one block at a time to report on each religious community in the entire city. A Journey Through New York City Religions might sound like a simple objective, but what Carnes found out was that there were far more religious organizations in New York City than he expected. In fact, he said that if he was to go through every single one, all of the mosques, the synagogues, the covens, the temples, the kingdom halls, and any other religious organization you might find, new ones would have appeared in his wake before he could finish. So New York City is a place where the world meets and people live together. In spite of difference, the diversity is astounding. As Carnes and his team of young journalists began working through the city, they found that many religious organizations were hesitant and guarded, and when they would attempt an interview. They reacted with fear to the journalists, as they expected the journalists to be an antagonistic force that would attempt to find negative things about their organizations. Carnes' mission was not to investigate, but rather to give voice to these diverse groups. Journey's mission statement includes that they hope that by showing the incredible variety and number of faith details about the city, that people will understand more deeply how such details contribute to the excitement of the city. Carnes realized that traditional journalism might not have equipped him and his staff with the proper tools to really get these diverse organizations to open up to them for these stories. And so he came up with a new method of interviewing, and just for interacting with people, that he dubbed sympathetic objectivity. So, sympathetic objectivity is a concept that I would like to share with you today, and I think it can have impact beyond journalism. I think it might be safe to say that we live in a more partisan world than we did just 20 years ago. This begs the question, why? Why are some families being torn apart in America and around the world? Because of political, religious, economic, or social views? Why are cities being razed, congressmen being threatened? What happened? Why has the world become more partisan in a time when we are more connected? And then the follow-up question must be, how can we run counter to culture and be peacemakers who bring people together instead of tearing them apart? This is where sympathetic objectivity comes in. We live in a world where we interact through media like never before in the history of humanity. So changing how we interact with the media might just help us change how we interact with the world. There is an American movie titled Spotlight. This is a docudrama that chronicles the Boston Globe's investigative reporting about abuse in the Catholic Church. If you've seen this movie, you have a glimpse into the mind of a traditional journalist. It's a phenomenal dramatization of real-world investigative journalism on one of the most impactful stories in the last 20 years. You see, journalists think that investigative journalism is the most valuable form of journalism, and other journalism is lesser. Now, don't get me wrong, investigative reporting is extremely important, but its conflict focus might have unintended consequences. You see, in journalism, and really in all media, conflict is the most important aspect of this ideology of journalism, and is even dubbed one of, if not the primary, news value. If there is no conflict, there is no story, according to some journalists. If it bleeds, it leads. We don't only see this in the news. It is also a basic value of entertainment. Every plot must have conflict, and thus conflict is valued in general in entertainment. You can trace this all the way back to Aristotle. And because in the beginning of any plot, you have to have the conflict that sets the action into motion. We see this most we see this in most, if not all, media today. Conflict is necessary for entertainment. Traditional media creators start with skepticism. They look for conflict problems, they distrust by nature, and they think of conflict as the most valuable aspect. Then, after skepticism, media creators must maintain objective distance. They must be above the debates and issues so they can report on them without fear or favor. And then if there's anything left beyond the conflict, or when the conflict is finished, there is sympathy or common feeling between the reporter and the interviewee. The triad of values says be skeptical first, then second, keep your distance, and then third, feel pity, sympathy, or affinity, but always subordinate the sympathy and affinity to skepticism and distance to objectivity. What kind of media does this create? Well, the old idiom, if it bleeds, it leads, makes sense. Now, right? We hear about the war, but not about the 100 years of peace. We hear about the affair, but not about the 40 years of faithfulness. We hear about the crime, but not about the one who left the life of addiction and made something of themselves. We get conflict from a skeptical perspective, but then the following question is just as important. What does all of this media do to us? Marshall McLuhan said that media are the extensions of the eyes and ears of the populace. If your eyes and ears only see and hear negativity, what does that do to the mind? Now, of course, 20 years ago, we had all of the same adversarial press and conflict-oriented media. So what was different? Why did the negativity of this form of legacy journalism and media in general not seem to have quite the deleterious effect on society? Why did people seem to be able to have differing opinions but coexist together? The short answer might be that legacy media did affect things, but just not as much, because back then the media was seen more as a tool. The news and entertainment media were things that you tuned in and out of. They were separate. The values of the press and the heritage news generation were exactly that, the values of the news and the media. And average people had their own values. Now, we literally have embodied or taken into our bodies media. We carry our little black boxes, our phones, everywhere we go. And we think with them, we socialize with them, we see through them, we hear through them, and now we even produce our own media with them. We have literally embodied, taken into our body communication. Now, through social media, we are the creators. We are the newscasters. We are the proto-journalists. We are the entertainers, the philosophers. And this has largely actually been positive. It's allowed for an explosion of knowledge and creativity, and it's developed like never before seen in the history of humanity. But the downside of that is that maybe we have embodied media, as we have embodied media, we have also started to embody, again, take into our bodies the values of media. Maybe with the dopamine training of social media, the training that when you find something you like, you get a hit of dopamine, and that dopamine causes you to want to like it again. So that dopamine training, mixed with the inherent conflict value in media, create a perfect storm of sorts that started dividing us apart. In the name of greater connection, we found greater opportunities for separation. We can see this in everyday life. How do we approach social media posts? We start with skepticism, right? Usually, we don't even get past skepticism. We just scroll on and cringe or unfriend or write a skeptical reply. But what can be done? Sympathetic objectivity flips the approach towards media creation and consumption, and by so doing, flips the approach to people. Instead of starting with skepticism, start with sympathy. Now, most of us know cheap sympathy. We are sympathetic to those who are like us. But what is sympathy really? According to Carnes, sympathy is fellow feeling or fellow understanding. What does this really mean? Carnes says we empathize with people to the extent that we can think and feel like them. This reproduction of the other person into ourselves is not complete. but enough for empathetic understanding. So to truly have sympathy, we must partition ourselves, everything that we believe and think, and sort of enter the universe of the other for a time. Really, some might be threatened by this, but when you're confident in yourself, you can take this brave step. So you try to actually think and feel like the other person, just for a little while. How do you do this? Well, Simon Sinek's famous leadership TED Talk, where he had the golden circles, might have a clue. Sinek might say that you have to find the common why in the person, instead of just understanding their how or their what. News memes, social media posts, etc., they're all so very concerned with the what and the how, the facts and the symbols and the mottos. When we really only deal with the whats, skepticism is easy and conflict is common. But when you set aside the what or even the how and try to find the common why, you not only have entered into the world of the other, but often the other isn't very different than you are. Finding the common why is at the heart of sympathetic objectivity. Instead of skeptically focusing on the surface, dig under the surface and find the why that you can sympathize with. One extreme example of someone who looked at the why instead of the what is Daryl Davis. Davis is a musician from Chicago who played boogie-woogie piano in the vein of Jerry Lee Lewis, B.B. King, or Bruce Hornsby. He was playing at a bar one night and he got into a conversation with a guy. And he later discovered that this guy that he was chatting with about music was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization in the United States. Now Davis is African American. And this chance meeting led Davis on a decades-long journey of befriending Klansmen, and subsequently seeing them leave the Klan and denounce their racist views. Davis uses the avenue of music to arrive at the destination of sympathy, sympathetic objectivity, or the why. Music is a language that transcends many other areas of difference. Because Davis and people in the Ku Klux Klan could find the commonality of the what of music, they could then form a relationship, and then Davis could illustrate to them his why, his humanity underneath the what. And the Klansmen were able to have sympathy or fellow feeling and fellow understanding for him. Davis had to be the first one to have sympathetic objectivity. He first saw their humanity under the what of racism. But by seeing their why and validating it, he helped them see his why, and more than 200 Klansmen have left their racist ways as a result. I discuss Davis here because he's an extreme example. But if he can find the why of his literal enemies, of people who actually wish him harm, maybe we can do the work to find the why of our friends and our enemies. Our friends and our families. I'm sorry, not our enemies. Our friends and our families. We can only truly see the why when we see through the eyes of the other person to some degree. As Atticus Finch famously said in To Kill a Mockingbird, you never really understand a person until you consider things from their point of view, until you climb into their skin and walk around in it a bit. So when you partition your own sense of self, not lose or subordinate, just partition, set it aside for a time to gain understanding, you can really begin to engage in sympathetic objectivity. So what does this mean for media creation and consumption? Well, I hope you already are getting an idea. When you're creating media, instead of just focusing on the what, the facts of every story, the conflict, try to drill down to the why. Try to see and highlight the humanity. And when you see that humanity in the other person, you then can communicate that. And I think that humanity might potentially be a more important reality than the what or the facts of the story. Perform sympathetic objectivity, flip the script, and start with sympathy. When you're consuming media, well, when you run into that ghastly Facebook post or that odious tweet, don't stop at the what. Retrain your brain to give you dopamine when you find the treasure of the why behind the what. Instead of blasting the odious post with a counterpunch, ask questions. Seek humanity and see that at most levels, that other person is just like you, a flawed human being trying to create a better world for the next generation. When you begin to see the shared humanity, when the fellow feeling really takes hold, the whats of the world seem less significant and compromise is possible. The last question might be, so what are the universal whys of humanity? My go-to why is I want to see a better world for my son Levi. Most people in most cultures and most dispositions want the world to be a better place for their kids. Now, one person might go about arriving at this why through the how of, say, environmentalism, or creating a healthier world for their children. And another person might try to achieve their why through the how of industrialism, or creating wealth and opportunity for their children. These two things might seem, again, like they have conflict in the how, at the how level. But the why is the same. So if you can use your sympathetic objectivity to see the why, and then maybe compromise is more possible on the less significant aspects of reality. All of the many hows and whats. Maybe together you could work on a more environmentally friendly industry because you both want a better world for your kids. So why not do everything possible to make that goal happen? When we can see that the other is human, just like us, the importance of the hows and the whats are mitigated by the humanity of the other person, and we can begin to find respect and compromise. Carnes says that the first assumption of sympathetic objectivity is that most people want to focus on what fills their lives with meaning, hope, and value. Drill down and find out what brings others' lives meaning, hope, and value, and you will begin to find the ability to live in a creative tension with the diverse whats and hows of the world. Carnes now has a team of journalists who are representing underrepresented groups in New York City. They have thousands of stories that highlight the humanity and dignity of the people of New York City. Sympathetic objectivity leads to constructive acts of journalism, media creation, and human relating. The more we grab hold of these ideas, sympathetic objectivity, fellow feeling, seeking the why instead of the what, seeing through the eyes of the other, the more we get this, the easier it will be to deal with the partisanship and diversity that we find in the world, and the more likely we are to create positive change in the world around us. Because we all just want to make the world a better place for our kids. Thank you.